It was the early morning of June 22nd, 1941. The world was about to witness the largest military invasion in history, Operation Barbarossa. The sun had not yet risen over the vast forested plains of Eastern Europe. In the German camps, tension was thick. Soldiers, many barely out of their teens, waited in silence, their faces lit only by the faint glow of cigarettes and the distant promise of dawn. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, there was an uneasy calm. Stalin, despite warnings from his intelligence services, refused to believe that Hitler would break their non-aggression pact. Soviet troops along the border were caught off guard, many still asleep or going about their morning routines. Then, without warning, all hell broke loose. At precisely 3:15 a.m., the German guns opened up, shattering the silence with a barrage of artillery and gunfire. Soviet soldiers were jolted awake by explosions and chaos. Across a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, 3 million German soldiers surged across the Soviet border. Hitler, surrounded by his top generals, watched as his meticulously planned betrayal unfolded. Thousands of aircraft screamed through the sky, artillery thundered, cities burned. Civilians fled in terror as the Luftwaffe unleashed its fury, and Soviet commanders scrambled to make sense of the onslaught. Just 2 years earlier, Hitler and Stalin had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a fragile agreement that divided Eastern Europe between them. But beneath the surface, distrust simmered. Hitler saw the Soviet Union as his ultimate enemy, and Stalin, though wary, was unprepared for the scale and speed of the German assault. On this fateful morning, the world changed forever. The betrayal was complete, and the Eastern Front was plunged into a war of unimaginable scale and brutality. And in Moscow, silence. Josef Stalin, the man who ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist, slept undisturbed. Just 2 years earlier, he had stunned the world by signing a non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler, his sworn ideological enemy. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as it became known, was more than a simple agreement. It was a cynical gamble by both dictators. Stalin hoped to buy time to rebuild his military, while Hitler sought to secure his eastern flank before turning west. In secret, the pact carved up Eastern Europe between the two powers, dooming millions. The world was left reeling. How could two bitter foes become partners overnight? The global impact was immediate. Britain and France, caught off guard, realized that war was now inevitable. For Poland, the pact spelled disaster, its fate sealed by signatures in Moscow and Berlin. But as the world watched in disbelief, Stalin's generals sensed the danger lurking beneath the surface. They knew something terrible had begun, yet even as the threat grew, they didn't dare wake him. The shadow of the pact loomed over all of Europe, its consequences about to unfold. This wasn't just a surprise attack. It was the eruption of a war driven by ideology, hatred, and ambition. For years, Hitler and Stalin had maintained a fragile alliance, sealed by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. This agreement secretly carved up Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, allowing both dictators to expand their empires without interference. Two monsters had once divided Europe between them, crushing nations like Poland and the Baltic states under their boots. Their cooperation shocked the world, but it was always uneasy, built on mutual distrust and ruthless calculation. Behind the scenes, Hitler viewed the Soviet Union as his ultimate enemy. Nazi ideology saw Bolshevism and Slavic peoples as threats to be destroyed, and Hitler's obsession with Lebensraum, living space, meant war with the East was inevitable. On June 22, 1941, Hitler shattered his pact with Stalin and unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Millions of soldiers surged across the border, igniting a brutal conflict that would decide the fate of Europe. This is the story of betrayal, ideology, and the catastrophic clash that changed the course of World War II. To truly grasp the magnitude of Hitler's betrayal, we must journey back to the tense days of 1939, when the fate of Europe hung in the balance. Europe stood on the brink of catastrophe. The continent was a powder keg, with alliances shifting and old empires crumbling. Hitler had already annexed Austria in the Anschluss, and emboldened by the appeasement of Western powers, he dismantled Czechoslovakia piece by piece. His gaze now turned eastward, to Poland, a nation caught between two hungry giants. But Hitler faced a strategic dilemma. Invading Poland risked igniting a two-front war, France and Britain to the west, the Soviet Union to the east. Memories of the First World War's devastating stalemate haunted German planners. Desperate to avoid this, Hitler sought a temporary solution. He reached out to his sworn ideological enemy Josef Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union. The world watched in disbelief as these two totalitarian regimes, one fascist, one communist, began secret talks. On August 23, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. Officially, it was a non-aggression pact, pledging that neither side would attack the other. To the outside world, it was a diplomatic bombshell. The pact stunned governments and citizens alike, shattering assumptions about the ideological divide between Nazism and communism. But beneath the surface, the real shock was hidden. Secret protocols, buried within the agreement, carved up Eastern Europe between the two powers. Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania were to be divided like spoils of war, an act of cold calculation between two ruthless regimes. Germany would seize Western Poland, fulfilling Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space for the German people. The Soviets would claim the East, absorbing the Baltic states, Bessarabia, and gaining a free hand in Finland, setting the stage for the brutal Winter War. It was a cold, cynical arrangement, one that bought both dictators time to prepare for their next moves. For a brief moment, Europe seemed eerily calm. On September 1, 1939, Hitler unleashed blitzkrieg on Poland from the west, using speed and terror to overwhelm defenses. 17 days later, as Poland reeled, Soviet tanks rolled in from the east, sealing the nation's fate. The Polish state was crushed, its people left to suffer under twin tyrannies. The stage was set for an even greater betrayal, the planning of Operation Barbarossa, as Hitler began to plot the ultimate surprise attack against his former ally, the Soviet Union. In the tense months of early 1941, Joseph Stalin was bombarded with warnings and intelligence reports, each more urgent than the last. British intelligence, German deserters, American diplomats, even his own spy Richard Sorge in Tokyo, all warned Hitler was preparing to strike. Yet Stalin dismissed these warnings, convinced they were part of a vast deception. He believed Hitler wouldn't risk a two-front war and trusted the non-aggression pact signed in 1939. Secretly, Stalin made his own preparations, fearing any provocation might give Hitler a pretext to attack. Paranoia shaped his decisions. Years of intrigue had taught him to trust almost no one. He suspected the British were trying to trick the USSR into war, seeing every warning as a trap. The Red Army, though vast, was leaderless and demoralized, plagued by confusion at every level. Aircraft were lined up wingtip to wingtip, easy targets for the Luftwaffe, as Soviet pilots waited for orders that never came. The Soviet Union, gripped by fear and suspicion, was a disaster waiting to happen, its fate sealed by a leader who refused to see the truth. At 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, the German Wehrmacht unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Over 3 million Axis troops surged across an 1,800-mile front, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. The night sky erupted as artillery lit the horizon, and the thunder of guns echoed across the border. Airfields were bombed, railways severed, and communication lines cut, plunging the Soviet defenses into chaos. In a single morning, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most of them caught on the ground before they could even take off. The Red Air Force, unprepared and paralyzed by Stalin's refusal to believe the warnings, was decimated in hours. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled in vast pockets as German panzer groups executed lightning-fast pincer movements. The Red Army, still reeling from Stalin's purges of its officer corps, struggled to mount a coordinated defense. In the Battle of Bialystok-Minsk alone, nearly 600,000 Red Army soldiers were captured, one of the largest encirclements in military history. The roads westward became rivers of prisoners, many doomed to die in captivity. German tanks rolled across the steppe, barely slowing down. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics, combining speed, surprise and overwhelming force, seemed unstoppable as they pushed deeper into Soviet territory. But this wasn't just war, it was genocide. Civilians fled in terror as entire villages were razed, and the German advance left a trail of destruction and death. Following the army were mobile killing squads, Einsatzgruppen, whose mission was to eliminate Jews, communists and any perceived enemies. These units, aided by local collaborators, began systematic massacres in towns and villages across the occupied territories. Within the first few months, over 500,000 people were massacred, men, women and children. The brutality of the invasion shocked the world, but inside the Soviet Union, fear and confusion reigned. Meanwhile, Stalin was silent. For over a week, Stalin said nothing, stunned, enraged and humiliated by the scale of the disaster. The Soviet leadership was paralyzed, unsure whether to fight, negotiate or flee. Some thought he might flee Moscow, fearing the collapse of his regime. Rumors swirled of panic and betrayal at the highest levels. Others feared he'd be overthrown by his own inner circle. But Stalin recovered, reasserting his authority and demanding total resistance. On July 3, 1941, he finally addressed the nation in a grim, determined radio broadcast. He called on the Soviet people to defend their homeland at all costs, framing the struggle as a fight for survival. The Great Patriotic War had begun. Across the Soviet Union, factories mobilized, citizens rallied, and the Red Army prepared for a long and brutal struggle, one that would decide the fate of Europe. Operation Barbarossa was conceived as a lightning war, Hitler's gamble to crush the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks. The German High Command believed the Red Army would collapse under the weight of the assault and that Moscow would fall before winter. Instead, the campaign devolved into a brutal war of attrition. The German advance slowed as Soviet resistance stiffened. Partisan fighters harassed supply lines. The vastness of the Soviet Union swallowed up the invaders, and the infamous Rasputitsa, seasons of mud, turned roads into quagmires. And then came the Russian winter, colder than anything the Germans had prepared for. Equipment froze, weapons jammed, and frostbite claimed thousands. The Soviets, better equipped for the cold, dug in and prepared for counterattack. The Battle of Moscow became a turning point. Stalin refused to abandon the city, and the Red Army launched a fierce defense. For the first time, the German blitzkrieg was halted. The Germans, unprepared for a prolonged campaign, were forced to retreat. Their myth of invincibility shattered, and the world saw that the Nazi war machine could be stopped. For the first time, the Soviets claimed a major victory. Propaganda celebrated the defense of Moscow as a symbol of Soviet resilience and unity. But the cost was staggering. Millions perished: soldiers, civilians, Jews, and prisoners of war. The German invasion unleashed a campaign of terror. Mass shootings, starvation, and the Holocaust by bullets. Entire cities were obliterated, villages razed, and families torn apart. The Eastern Front became a slaughterhouse, the deadliest theater of the war. Hitler's betrayal of Stalin shattered the Nazi-Soviet pact and plunged both nations into a conflict marked by unprecedented brutality. The failure of Barbarossa marked the beginning of the end for Hitler. The German army, stretched thin and battered, would never fully recover. The myth of Nazi invincibility was broken, and the Allies gained hope. The Soviet Union, battered but unbroken, mobilized its vast resources. Factories were relocated east of the Urals, and the Red Army was rebuilt, stronger and more determined than ever. The tide of war turned. The Soviets began their relentless push westward, eventually storming Berlin. Operation Barbarossa set the stage for the total defeat of Nazi Germany and the division of Europe in the post-war world. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which began with cynical handshakes and secret protocols, ended in fire and betrayal. The trust between the two dictators was shattered forever. Operation Barbarossa turned former allies into bitter enemies, fueling a war of ideology, race and survival. The propaganda war intensified, and the world was drawn deeper into global conflict. The consequences of Barbarossa were profound and lasting. The Eastern Front became the crucible of World War II, shaping the fate of millions and redrawing the map of Europe. In the end, the Soviet victory would help bring about the collapse of the Nazi regime, but at a cost that would haunt generations. The legacy of Operation Barbarossa endures in memory, in scars, and in the lessons of history. Operation Barbarossa was not just a military campaign. It was the largest invasion in history, involving over 3 million Axis soldiers and stretching across a front more than 1,800 miles long. The consequences of Hitler's betrayal of Stalin would reshape the fate of millions and alter the course of the 20th century. If you found this exploration of Operation Barbarossa insightful, please like the video and share your thoughts or questions in the comments below. Your engagement helps us bring more untold stories to light. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dive documentaries into World War II history. From the frozen forests outside Moscow to the burning ruins of Stalingrad, every chapter reveals new layers of blood, betrayal, and consequence. We're here to uncover the complexities of history, one chapter at a time. Because understanding the past is the key to understanding our world today.